The language of security is written in range, time, and fear, and today Eastern Europe is watching a clock it did not set, counting down to strikes it cannot prevent. The warning from Warsaw about a deep strike threat from Russia is not a moral plea or a theatrical escalation. It is the predictable expression of a state that sits on the seam between a great power's war aim and a superpower's alliance promise, and it reflects a structural reality that has defined European history since kingdoms learned that the best defense against a cavalry charge was to destroy the stables across the frontier before the horses were bridled. Poland declares what geography and capacity already imply, that any war fought within reach of precision munitions and mass firepower migrates from the front to the depth, from trenches to depots, from borders to capitals, because modern war is not won by holding ground but by breaking systems. And once that logic takes hold, the fear that binds allies can turn into the dynamism that drives escalation, not by peace treaties, but by power balances. When Poland raises the specter of deep strikes, it invokes the arithmetic of modern deterrence as surely as it invokes memory. The missiles stationed in Kaliningrad, the aviation platforms in Russia's western military district, the strike packages in Belarus, and the underwater launch cells that extend reach from the Baltic are not abstractions. They define a radius that touches command nodes, logistics hubs, and energy choke points across the Polish plain. The Iskander launchers that officially reach 500 kilometers but likely exceed it under wartime envelopes, the long-range air-launched cruise missiles that ride low against radar horizons, the sea-based Kaliber variants that move along the Baltic like quiet accountants of distance. Together they turn the question from "Will Russia strike deep?" to "Under what conditions would it choose not to?" That question is the heart of what Warsaw is signaling, because the answer does not depend on speeches. It depends on whether Russia perceives a tight enough correlation between the destruction of Polish depth and the survival of Russian forces at the front, and whether NATO can sever that correlation fast enough to keep Poland's depth politically off limits. Poland's preparations reflect that knowledge. It spends above 4% of GDP on defense, acquires F-35s to range across contested skies, orders HIMARS and K-239 systems to compress the enemy sanctuary, layers Patriot and future Neru capabilities to thin out inbound salvos, and turns Rzeszów and Lublin into arteries of military logistics that feed a war next door, while telegraphing to Moscow that the arteries cannot be cut without bleeding the alliance. That infrastructural bet is both strategic and tragic. The more effectively Poland serves as NATO's rear for Ukraine, the more militarily rational it becomes for Russia to degrade that rear. The more Poland hardens and signals resolve, the more it convinces Russia that mere demonstration strikes will not suffice. This is not new. During the First World War, when artillery reached deeper than politics anticipated, rear areas ceased to be civilian spaces and became part of the battle space, and when the Second World War fused air power and industrial targeting, the home front was no longer a metaphor. Today, the same principle, armed with precision, returns with a ledger and a map. The security dilemma is not a slogan. It is the mechanism by which each side, acting defensively according to its own narrative, produces the very aggressiveness the other feared. Poland's reinforcement of its air defenses, its integration with NATO's air tasking orders, the forward deployment of Allied battle groups from the Baltics down to the Black Sea, all are defensible moves if you believe war must be deterred by certainty of punishment. In Moscow, the same moves are read as prepositioning for interdiction of Russian territory, The stitching of a missile net meant not to protect Polish skies, but to enable continuous fire into Russia's operational rear if the Ukraine war metastasizes. That is how we get from warning to contingency planning, and from contingency planning to target lists, and from target lists to night raids that transform what was once sovereign depth into permissible space for preventive action. Every state wants peace on its own terms. The balance of power in Eastern Europe now rests on three interlocking realities. First, Russia cannot afford a defeat that looks like a historic rollback of influence from its near abroad, and therefore it will accept higher costs and greater risk to avoid that outcome, including operations designed to dissuade external support by creating pain in the supplier's rear. Second, NATO cannot allow a precedent in which coercive strikes against a member state's depth go unpunished, because that erodes the credibility of Article 5 and accelerates the unraveling of the alliance's deterrent fabric. Third, minor states, especially those in the Baltic and along the Suwałki corridor, survive through the speed and resolve of a distant hegemon whose attention is split between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. The vector that results from those three realities points toward a contest of strike and counterstrike bounded not by moral lines, but by the bandwidth of escalation control. And as the bandwidth narrows, doctrine grows brittle. History teaches the same lesson in different uniforms. Athens feared a rising Sparta in logistics more than in direct battle and struck with reach where it could. Rome understood that the security of its heartland required preemptive campaigns into the periphery. Britain made industrial depth a legitimate target as it blockaded continental rivals. The United States and the Soviet Union spent the Cold War mapping each other's command and control, as if those maps were peace treaties. The continuity is not mystical, it is structural. Who controls whose capacity to wage war decides who dictates the peace. If Poland's logistical hubs move ammunition east, they become meaningful targets. If Russia's strike systems can hold those hubs at risk, Russia can shift the equilibrium. If NATO's integrated air and missile defenses can attrit incoming salvos at politically acceptable levels, the balance stabilizes. If not, deterrence by denial fails, and deterrence by punishment becomes the only lever, which replaces air defense with target selection in Russia's depth. The tragedy is obvious. The instruments purchased to prevent war become the means by which war broadens. In the present case, energy corridors make the ledger explicit. The Baltic Pipe, the LNG terminals on the Baltic coast, the power interconnectors that reduce dependence on Russian gas, all are strategic assets because they compress Russia's leverage over energy. But precisely because they reduce vulnerability, they increase their salience as wartime targets, whether by sabotage, cyber operations that interrupt distribution in winter, or standoff attacks that demonstrate both capacity and willingness to impose painful externalities. The logic of coercion requires striking where the opponent values continuity most, not where the battlefield maps end. Poland understands this and invests in redundancy, dispersion, and layered protection. Russia understands this and invests in long-range precision munitions, electronic warfare to blind radar, and deceptive doctrines that force defenders to exhaust interceptors on false tracks before the real salvos arrive. It is not a morality play. It is a calculus problem measured in magazine depth and reload cycles. Alliance politics add another layer of necessity. The United States keeps a forward headquarters and rotational forces in Poland not out of sentiment, but out of an old principle, firm up the center of gravity along the seam where a rival's short-notice strike options are richest. The Vistula Corridor and the approaches to the Suwałki Gap are not simply dots on a map. They are the gates through which reinforcement flows north to the Baltic states and south to the Black Sea region, and the narrower those gates appear under fire, the more the alliance must show that it can and will hold them open. Germany and other European allies contribute, but the military nut remains American. Command and control, ISR, aerial refueling, the high-end air defense, and the plausible nuclear umbrella that keeps Russian planners honest about thresholds. As always, the smaller allies read the hegemon's attention as fate. If Washington is distracted or divided, they hedge with more spending, more fortification, and more public warnings, because clarity in signaling is the currency of survival for states that cannot fight alone for long. Deterrence, however, is a wasting asset unless the adversary believes that the costs of striking outweigh the benefits at the exact moment when striking appears to promise survival elsewhere. That is the problem with rear area warnings during an attritional war. If Russia calculates that the attrition rate of its forces at the front is unsustainable unless the flow of Western munitions and components through Poland is slowed, if it further calculates that targeted, deniable, or limited strikes into Polish depth might fracture alliance resolve rather than unite it, and if finally it calculates that nuclear signaling can fence in escalation, then the rational choice, from Russia's vantage point, is to accept the risk of deep strike. We can deplore this view, but we cannot dismiss it, because war rewards the logic that preserves the actor, not the logic that preserves norms. In turn, Poland must calculate whether allowing its depth to be terrorized without massive retaliation erodes future stability more than retaliating would, and NATO must calculate whether solidarity requires going after the launchers and the command nodes on the other side of the border. The math does not permit easy answers, it forces costly ones. The winners and losers of the power ledger will not be decided in a week. Russia holds escalation options in depth because it owns the sanctuary from which to fire. Poland holds alliance options in breadth because it participates in a network of states that can spread the cost of defense and retaliation. Russia's economy, constrained by sanctions but reoriented toward a war footing, can produce munitions at levels that sustain pressure. Poland's economy, integrated with the European core and backed by American technology, can absorb shocks and outinvest in air defense and precision strike. In the medium term, if the war remains localized, Poland gains durable military capacity and political capital inside NATO, moving from frontline state to pivotal state. Russia pays a price in resources and isolation, but retains coercive leverage if it can demonstrate that NATO depth is penetrable. In the long term, the arrival of a multipolar order complicates the theater. Chinese ambitions in the Indo-Pacific strain American bandwidth. Energy transitions shift the value of choke points. Technology diffusion lowers the barrier to long-range fires. The ledger will show alternating columns of advantage, but the rule will be the same. Depth that matters becomes depth that is targeted. Moral aims will keep arriving at the podium, and security imperatives will keep arriving at the targeting cell. The former says, we will deter by making aggression illegitimate. The latter says, we will deter by making aggression impossible to succeed. The difference is not philosophical, it is operational. No adversary who believes deep strike is the only way to survive in the field will be deterred by condemnation. They will be deterred, if at all, by an air defense architecture that catches more than it misses, by counter battery fires that silence launchers before they reload, by cyber and EW measures that increase the uncertainty of success, and by a visible willingness to widen the battlefield when the alternative is slow erosion of security credibility. Poland's warning is a real-time expression of this reality. It is not asking the world to outlaw deep strike. It is telling the world that the conditions under which deep strike occurs are ripening, and that unless those conditions are changed through superior capacity and unambiguous commitments, the strikes will come. The propaganda that follows such warnings is inevitable because both sides need narratives that justify future choices already baked into their force structures. Russia will say that any attack beyond Ukraine is a necessary response to NATO's invisible hand. Poland will say that any hardening of its rear is a purely defensive act. NATO will say it seeks only to prevent war from expanding, and each will hold up maps, photographs, and casualty figures to prove their point. None of this changes the structural incentives. In every major conflict where modern strike range outpaced diplomatic imagination, actors expanded the target set until the other side's confidence cracked or its resources did. When it did not crack, the target set expanded further. That is why the current talk of red lines and proportional response will ring hollow if one side believes the balance is slipping. The lesson of the Cold War is not that nuclear weapons prevented escalation by making leaders wise. It is that they forced caution when leaders judged that the marginal gain from escalation did not justify the catastrophic risk. If leaders believe the marginal gain is survival, their restraint narrows to a sliver. Minor states along the arc from Tallinn to Bucharest know this and behave accordingly. They diversify their energy, harden their grids, stockpile munitions, and integrate air pictures to buy precious minutes of warning. Their domestic politics revolve around the tension between national pride and alliance dependence. The former wants autonomy in escalation decisions. The latter requires coordination that slows response but widens protection. The internal debates are not about morality, they are about timing. Strike first to deter or strike only in response to preserve legitimacy. Concentrate forces to present a bristling defense or disperse forces to survive the inevitable surprise, announce red lines publicly, or keep thresholds ambiguous to complicate adversary planning. These are the questions Poland, the Baltics, and others live with. And when Warsaw speaks of deep strike, it is also speaking to Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn, reminding them that their depth is thinner, their buffers shorter, and their dependence on alliance speed greater. There is an economic front to this as well, and it follows the same grim logic. Sanctions that aim to compress Russia's war-making potential push Russia to forge parallel supply chains and barter arrangements with states outside the Western system. As those chains mature, Russia's vulnerability to Western economic pressure declines while its dependence on military leverage increases, because only through coercion can it influence outcomes within the Western orbit. Conversely, Poland's integration into European supply chains and American defense production ties its security to economic flows that must not be interrupted. Hence, logistical nodes and industrial parks supporting defense contracts become targets not just for missiles but for sabotage, cyber disruption, and political agitation designed to reduce throughput without triggering overt war. The contest thus becomes a matter of attacking the opponent's margins of production and distribution without crossing thresholds that activate automatic retaliation. The moral vocabulary that states deploy to describe these attacks Defense, necessity, proportionality will not control the escalation ladder if the structural incentives do not change. The nuclear shadow hovers, but not as a moral prohibition. It hovers as a limit to stupidity. Russia will use that shadow to signal that certain types of strikes on its core assets risk a response that no ally is prepared to test. NATO will answer with its own shadow and keep ready forces in the air to demonstrate resolve. The practical effect is not that no one strikes, it is that they strike within envelopes they believe are safe, testing each other's tolerance until a mistake adjusts the envelope. That is why wars do not expand through deliberate leaps. They expand through miscalculation about where the other side's tolerance ends. Deep strike debates live in this gray area. A small probing attack, a deniable sabotage, a one-off calibration strike. Each seems manageable. Each creates precedent. Each lowers the psychological barrier to the next act. The back and forth will be framed as deterrence messaging, but it is better understood as a negotiation through violence, in which the auctioneer's gavel is reach and the currency is risk. The human cost does not contradict this logic, it confirms it. Civilians become part of the depth that militaries measure. The sirens in Polish cities that test readiness, the disruptions to commerce as airspace is restricted, the strains on budgets as social spending yields to air defense procurement, all are predictable effects of states preparing to live under strike threat. Russia's civilians pay too, through a war economy that prioritizes shells over services and a political climate that normalizes emergency as routine. The human desire to turn away is real, but the logic of survival is stronger. And when those desires collide, governments choose survival. The rhetoric about rules-based orders and civilizational missions is the veil over a simpler truth. States endure by discouraging attack on the systems that keep them alive. And when that discouragement fails, they attack the systems that keep their adversaries alive. It is the oldest contract in international politics, written in the same ink, whether the quill is Athenian or American. Strategically, the deep strike question in Eastern Europe is a prelude to a broader realignment. The end of unipolarity weakens centralized crisis management. The rise of multipolar competition increases opportunities for adventurism, and technological diffusion puts weapons once held by superpowers into the hands of regional actors with local ambitions. In such a world, the temptation to solve local military problems by striking depth increases because what used to require a superpower's industrial base can now be rented from a coalition of suppliers. Poland's warning is therefore not only about Russia, it is about the future of deterrence in a system where alliances are flexible, great powers are distracted, and the margins between war and peace are managed by systems engineers rather than diplomats. The tragedy is that as the tools for deep strike become cheaper and more precise, the thresholds for their use will oscillate unpredictably, governed by shifting perceptions of resolve rather than stable doctrines. For Poland, the immediate task is brutally clear. Increase the density of air and missile defenses, expand magazine depth, improve discrimination to conserve interceptors, harden logistics to survive first salvos, and maintain political unity to ensure retaliation is automatic rather than debated. For Russia, the task is no less clear. Accumulate and preserve long-range strike inventories, diversify launch platforms to complicate defenses, exploit seams in alliance decision-making, and pair salvos with information operations that fracture public support for escalation. For NATO, the problem is structural speed. Can the alliance make a decision at the tempo that missiles fly, and can it credibly threaten what Russia values most at the moment? Russia believes deep strike will save its campaign. If the answer is yes, deterrence holds. If the answer is no, deep strike will come, and after the dust, the debates will look like they always do, long on outrage, short on capacity. This is not cynicism, it is the operational grammar of international politics. Disputes over culpability and legality will continue, but the only arguments that matter in this realm are those delivered by platforms and measured by readiness rates. Poland has chosen to speak plainly about that reality because it must. It sits on the edge of a war that has already erased many of the red lines Europe thought it had, and it understands that the most important red line is not rhetorical. It is the percentage of incoming missiles that do not arrive. Russia has chosen to signal its own reality, that it will not accept defeat in the field, and that depth, if necessary, will be brought into play. Between these positions stands an alliance whose unity is both its greatest asset and its point of vulnerability, because unity must be proven under pressure, not merely declared at summits. In time, a settlement may be reached, as they usually are, when exhaustion meets limited objectives and fear meets the desire to consolidate gains. It will be sold as a victory for principle or a triumph of diplomacy. But anyone who studies the structure will know what truly ended the phase, a recalibration of power balances that made further escalation unprofitable for the principal actors. If Poland survives without a major strike on its depth, it will be because its defenses held and its alliance deterred. If it suffers such strikes but endures, it will be because punishment and resilience convince the attacker that the costs outweighed the benefits. Neither outcome changes the underlying rule. States do not prefer peace in general. They prefer peace under conditions that make them secure. When those conditions are absent, they climb ladders they built years earlier, rung by rung, to places where they never intended to stand. Thus, the warning from Warsaw matters not because it is novel, but because it is honest. It tells us that the strike options exist, that the incentives to use them are rising, and that only a credible, tangible shift in the balance of capabilities and the clarity of alliance response can dissuade their use. Every state in the region will parse that statement through its own vulnerability, and each will draw conclusions that move budgets, deployments, and procurement lists. And as those lists grow, others will warn that preparations make escalation more likely. Both will be right, and the system will grind forward, as it always does, toward a compromise imposed by capacity. This is how power works, and there is no escaping it.